Andrew Petiprin. I am Fellow of Popular Culture at the Word on Fire Institute. Incredible privilege that I get to be here with you, and a special privilege that I get to be here with my friends Holly Ordway and Father Michael Ward. All three of us, by the way, are what is in just sort of popular parlance called converts from Anglicanism. So any other former Anglicans in the room? There might even be some current Anglicans in the room. If you are, God bless you. Welcome. We're going to talk about an Anglican today. Before we go any further, I'd like to just tell you a little more about Holly and Father Michael so that if you're not familiar with their work, you can sit there while listening to them on your phones and order their books. That's one of the best things you could do with your time. Father Michael Ward is a Catholic priest of the Personal Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. And like me, actually a former Anglican cleric before he was a Catholic priest. He's also a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford and professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University in Texas. He is author of the great book Planet Narnia, which I hope all of you have read or at least intend to read and have it on your shelf. It's a wonderful book. He's also the author of After Humanity, which is a book about C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, which was published by us at Word on Fire. And I'm pleased to say that Father Michael and I, along with David Baird, a third contributor, have a book coming out this year called Popcorn with the Pope, which is a guide to the films on the Vatican film list. So, did any of you know there was such a thing as the Vatican film list? Well, you're going to want to buy our book. Come down, for sure. So welcome to Father Michael. Holly is my colleague at Word on Fire. She's the Fellow of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, and she holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She is the author of Tolkien's modern reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, which is an absolutely fantastic book that you must all read. She's also the author of Tales of Faith, and is the author of the forthcoming spiritual biography of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is called Tolkien's Faith, a spiritual biography, due out later this year, also from Word on Fire. I'm told that you can pre-order that book in the United States on Amazon, but not here in the UK yet. So please be on the lookout for that when it comes out. But I'm just delighted to be able to share the stage today with Holly and with Michael. So let's launch right in. If all of you are here today, I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with the two authors that we're going to discuss today, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who are two giants of 20th century literature in the English language, to be sure. And I can certainly speak from my own experience as somebody whose faith was transformed and deepened by reading both of them at different times in my life. And that's one of the many things that we want to get at here today. So before we go any further, although I'm sure you all know who each of these men are and what they've written, at least in part, let's just have each of our speakers just sketch briefly who each man was and what his faith was like. So I think we'll start with Lewis. Michael, tell us about Lewis and his faith.
Yes, so when Andrew mentioned that we're going to be discussing the Anglican we're going to be discussing is C.S. Lewis. I'm glad that we are at this Catholic conference spending some serious time considering such a figure. He was born at the end of the 19th century in Belfast to an Anglican family. His grandfather was an Anglican clergyman in Belfast. He was baptized as an infant, brought up in the faith, but then, perhaps in part because of his mother's death when he was not quite 10, in his teens, Lewis turned away from his faith and then called himself an atheist for the best part of 2 decades. Although during that period he was actually confirmed in the Church of England, and he later called that one of the worst things he ever did, being confirmed in utter disbelief. He did it because it was socially expected, and his father sort of required it of him, but he was later very ashamed of it. Lewis fought in the First World War, was very nearly killed, saw men die, saw the battlefield littered with sitting and standing corpses, as he later recalled, had a brilliant career at Oxford, reading first of all classics and then English. He got first-class degrees in both subjects, and he then spent about 30 years as a fellow in English at Oxford before moving to the other place, Cambridge, where he finished his career as the very first professor of medieval Renaissance English at Cambridge. As regards his faith, he slowly inched his way back to, first of all, a belief in God, a theistic belief in the late 1920s, and then, thanks in no small part to Tolkien, as we will no doubt be discussing in a moment, finally got his way back to Christian belief in his early 30s. And after he had returned to the Christian faith of his infancy, his faith life took off, and he began to become a very prominent Christian apologist. His best-known work in that line is probably Mere Christianity, which was based on radio broadcasts he gave during the Second World War. But also, of course, he's very well known for his Christian fiction, most notably the Chronicles of Narnia and works like the Screwtape Letters. His late life was interesting in that in his late 50s, he finally got round to being married. He married a divorced ex-Jewish communist atheist Christian American, Joy Davidman, and you may have seen the film Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger, which is a beautiful, though rather inaccurate, telling of that late romance in his life, which gave rise to one of his most challenging books, a short book called A Grief Observed, in which he talks about seeing his wife die and the grief that it occasioned. And Lewis himself died just 3 years after his wife in 1963, on the very same day, the very same hour that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas.
That's very helpful, Michael. And let's hear maybe the same kind of précis from you, Holly, about Tolkien and his life and his sort of development of faith.
Right, so Tolkien was actually born in Bloemfontein, South Africa, in 1892, so a little bit older than Lewis, and he also was born an Anglican. His parents were members of the Anglican Church there, and so the first 8 years of his life were lived as a child in the Anglican Church. His father died when he was 4. His mother brought him back to him and his little brother Hilary brought him back to England as now as a widow. And then in 1900, she entered the Catholic Church. And at the time, this was just a catastrophic social move. She was effectively cut off by her family. They cut off financial help for her, so she was then suddenly impoverished as a widow with 2 small boys. It was a hard thing to be a Catholic convert at that time, but she stuck with it, and this impressed Tolkien greatly. He remembered all his life the great cost that his mother paid for her faith and the effort she made to hand it on to him. But interestingly, because he was 8 when his mother became a Catholic, he was actually past the age of reason, past the age at which he would have been, as it were, grandfathered into the Catholic Church with his mother. So he was considered as someone who came into the church in his own right, as an adult, at his confirmation and First Holy Communion, which at that time took place at the same time, just before his 12th birthday. So I think it's really interesting to note that Tolkien is also a convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism, because in that era, he had the opportunity to return to the faith of his dead father and to his grandparents on both sides, but chose instead to continue in the church that his mother had adopted. And he would have remembered his Anglican youth, because at 8 years old, he had a very strong memory and could remember things from even when he was a little child. So his mother then died when he was 12, leaving him a complete orphan, and he was raised then by his guardian, Father Francis Morgan, of the Birmingham Oratory of St. Philip Neri. And this became a tremendous influence on his life, the congregation of St. Philip Neri. So he ended up falling in love with Edith Bratt, who was a Protestant, and getting extremely distracted from his studies, so much so that his guardian said, "You cannot see her again until you come of age." And interestingly, Tolkien accepted this. So we have this sort of conventional narrative of the hard-hearted Catholic priest squashing young love, But in fact, he said it was very hard and painful and bitter, but he came later on to recognize that his guardian had been right, because he had, in fact, failed his first entrance exam into Oxford, and being poor, he had to get a scholarship where he wasn't going to go. And his guardian, I think, saw immediately that this was his career, his vocation to be a scholar. So he ended up getting into Oxford, and on the night he turned 21 and was therefore free of his promise, which he had kept, he wrote to his girlfriend Edith, renewing his love and wanting to marry her, and she wrote back to say that she was engaged to another man. But Tolkien, nothing daunted, set off by train to Birmingham, arrived, convinced her to break off the engagement and marry him instead. And they did. She became a Catholic, and they married. He finished his degree at Oxford right as the Great War was happening. So he finishes his degree and he goes into the carnage of the Great War, like Lewis. And as Tolkien reflected later, he said, by 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead. So he really felt that devastation, but didn't lose his faith. He persisted in his faith during the war, but then had a 10-year slump after it, where he said, I almost ceased to practice my religion. Almost. He didn't completely, but almost ceased. He ended up he taught at Leeds. He came back to Oxford, where he made the acquaintance of a certain atheist who later became a Christian, C.S. Lewis. They became great friends. Lewis was hugely influential in his life as well. And there he settled in as a professor of Anglo-Saxon and of English literature for the rest of his career at Oxford, became a world-class philologist, specialist in the history of languages, of development of English. And, oh, by the way, in his spare time, apart from raising 4 children, he wrote The Hobbit, and then he wrote a sequel to The Hobbit, which took 10 years to write and almost didn't get published. This book was called something you may have heard of, The Lord of the Rings. And this book he called a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, which is really interesting because there's no overt religion in it. It's all underneath. It's all in the foundations of it. And it's for that, obviously, that he's most well known. And he didn't do any overt sort of apologetics. We could talk more about some of these things he did do, but his great essay on fairy stories actually contains in its epilogue quite a strong proclamation of the gospel. So he was actually more evangelically minded, more minded towards evangelization than I think a lot of people realize. A very, very interesting figure. And he died 50 years ago this year.
Wow, that's wonderful. Interesting. I want to come back to on fairy stories in a minute, but I just want to stick with you for just 1 second to tease out his childhood at the Birmingham Oratory, because I know that there will be some big fans like me of St. John Henry Newman here. So this is something that I never really realized until engaging with you on this question, Holly, that, I mean, he was really raised a generation removed from St. John Henry Newman.
Yes.
So what, I mean, was he influenced by Newman? Did he know his work, or was would you consider his thought to be like Newman at all?
I do, and in my research for this new biography, I found that connection is much stronger than I realized. So we don't, in the materials we have extant, we don't have direct evidence that he knew specific works of Newman's, but he obviously knew Newman's work. So his guardian, Father Francis Morgan, had actually been Newman's personal secretary. So this is a first-hand connection, and other members of the oratory where he grew up had known Newman well, had been, taught by Newman, had been brought into the oratory by them. So he lived in an atmosphere that was just utterly shaped by Newman's thought, and it's shaped by the English oratorians of the Birmingham Oratory, not just Father Francis, but all of those oratorians. Many of whom became his lifelong friends, not just Father Francis, whom he considered to be a second father. So I think we really can see a kind of spiritual lineage. So in terms of spiritual influence, I mean, Father Francis Morgan, he called him his second father, and he had been, brought into the Oratorian order by Newman. So I think we can really look at Newman as a kind of spiritual grandfather to Tolkien. And we really do see, especially in Tolkien's attitude towards ecumenism, very, very close similarity to Newman's thought. I think it's absolutely the case that he knew Newman's thought on these matters.
That's fascinating. I want to come back to ecumenism in a second, but let's launch right into this evangelization question, because that's sort of the topic that we've been given. And Michael, let me come back to you and just pose it this way. So Lewis was somebody who was evangelized by his friends, and particularly by Tolkien. In what way did he sort of grow out of that experience he had of being evangelized and think of himself as an evangelist in his literary work and maybe even his teaching career?
Very good question. Lewis was... Well, he described himself as having passed over from atheism to Christianity. Though, of course, as I said in the little sketch I gave, he had been baptized and raised in the faith of his first 10 or 12 years. So it's more like a resumption of a faith that he had turned his back on. His brother said that it was more like the recovery after a long convalescence. But it wasn't just returning to a cold meal, warming it up again. It was much more a putting down of his roots much more deeply into really fertile, well-watered ground, and he suddenly flourished in his faith. And one man who knew him well, Walter Hooper, the late Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's editor and biographer, once described Lewis as the most converted man he ever knew. There was almost nothing that his newfound faith did not touch. Bishop Barron was earlier talking about the responsibility of the laity to follow the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And I think a good case can be made for the fact that Lewis did follow those counsels pretty faithfully, especially poverty. He was very, very generous with his money. He once said that unless our charities are actually causing us to go without, then we're probably not giving enough. And he once got in trouble with a taxman because he managed to, he got so many royalties and then gave them away so instantly, and then was landed with a huge tax bill that he couldn't pay. But to your point about evangelism, yes, he had been evangelized. He could remember what it was like to be outside a living faith. He could remember the perplexities, the oddities, the weirdness of the faith. And I think that's one of the reasons that he became such an effective apologist evangelist, that he didn't forget it. And so he was able to help people over the stiles and the hurdles into, well, first of all, into just a sort of preparedness to accept faith. What Lewis calls the preparatio evangelica, just laying the groundwork for faith. You mentioned kindly in your introduction that I've written this guide to Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. And The Abolition of Man is not an obviously evangelistic work. It's a philosophical work. It's all about objective value. But Lewis saw that before you can begin to, as it were, present a Christian case for how Jesus will allow our Christian faith will allow us to be good and true and beautiful in our own way, you have to establish that goodness, truth, and beauty are real qualities and not just our subjective projections upon the world. And that's what he attempts to do in The Abolition of Man, which I think in some ways can be regarded as the theme of his output as a writer. And all the other works that he ever put out were sort of variations upon that theme. Goodness, truth, and beauty are objective realities, and we need to accord our life so that they respond to these objective realities. Interestingly, in his path back to faith, he said that in some ways he was evangelized by non-Christians. that is to say, non-Christians who accepted the objectivity of value, who were good, chaste, honest. They were following the light as far as it had been granted to them. And Lewis, in his very atheistic phase, had supposed that these were voluntary subjects. They weren't to be required of all candidates. Sobriety, chastity, honesty. Well, if you want it, go for it. But then these young men at Oxford, who, by the way, none of them Christians, he said, by their very attempt to be virtuous, evangelized Lewis, which I think is a very interesting way of realizing that God's grace works in very mysterious ways, not just through the professionally religious or the deliberately evangelistic, but through any number of means.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'd never heard that before about the being evangelized by these Christians. Very wonderful. Holly, just so building on what Father Michael just said, so in my mind, I think of Lewis. Lewis has so many tools, and first of all, one of the things that we've already named this, but we want to highlight it a little bit more, is that both Lewis and Tolkien were laymen. They were lay people, right? Which is one of the themes, of course, that Bishop Barron was talking about, and I think a very important aspect to both of their lives and their work of evangelization. But when I think of Lewis's literary output, it's like he's got all these different tools, like literary tools for evangelization, right? I mean, there are some days when mere Christianity just knocks it out of the park for me. Sorry, that's an American baseball. Bishop Barron did the same thing. I don't know.
Hit it for six.
Right, whatever. Hit it for six. Exactly. Right, when Lewis lays out just with this sort of logical beauty, the trilemma, right? That ends with, or you can worship him as the Lord or whatever. I mean, it just like brings tears to my eyes, right? But then there are times when, more satisfying is reading The Silver Chair and reading the part where Jill faces Aslan at the stream and he says, there is no other stream. Just bowls me over. Now, Tolkien didn't have the same kind of, he wasn't on the radio, for example, during World War II, essentially delivering the talks that would become the most famous book of Christian apologetics in the English language, right? But he had a different thing going in many respects in his life. So I guess what I'm getting at is, personally, they both have sort of different things to draw from in their evangelistic endeavors. One of them that occurs to me is, even though, Michael, you mentioned that Lewis married late in his life and he did end up becoming responsible for a couple of children, right? Tolkien was a family man through and through. He had a whole house full of kids, right? And he's, hiding away at night trying to write his thing. So I guess what I'm getting at is just maybe a very open-ended question back to you about sort of how is this combination of factors in his life sort of adding up to create an evangelist?
That's a great question. And it kind of comes back to again, Bishop Barron's call earlier to the layman to go out and be living the faith and living these counsels, because Tolkien did that. I mean, he really did that. And we should remember that, The Lord of the Rings was published quite late in his life, 1954. So he had already had a long career as an academic. He had retired, so he had a little bit of fame as from The Hobbit, but of a relatively minor kind. The great fame of The Hobbit kind of came after The Lord of the Rings, but came back. Oh, there's the other book that he wrote. So for most of his life, he was witnessing through his life, through his ordinary life, through fidelity to his wife. And so that's, again, living out that counsel of chastity, as a married man being faithful to his wife, through sickness and in health, of which there was quite a lot of sickness. For instance, Tolkien, his health was really permanently damaged by his getting trench fever in the Great War. He had a very bad case of it, and it damaged his health permanently. And they were usually short of money. I mean, with 4 children, this is before the NHS, he's trying to educate them in Catholic schools, he's trying to provide for them, and he had a job as a professor, but he was also grading examination papers during the vacations for extra money. So this is a man who is just really doing what it takes to raise up his family and provide for them. But he's living out this life as a witness to his family. And he's also being very active as a layman in Oxford. So he's visible as a role model to his students. He was involved in a number of Catholic associations, the Newman Association, the Newman Society, the Catenians. He was really active in these organizations dedicated to strengthening the faith of Oxford students in particular, and of just Oxford ordinary people, the Catenians, at a time when he had a lot of things on his plate. He could easily have said, I'll just leave that to the priests, let them handle that. I've got my own work to do. But he didn't. He gave it his time and his energy when those were really in short supply. And I think that has a lot to do with the Catholic impact, the Christian impact of Lord of the Rings, because when he is presenting his story, which is a story about good and evil and beauty and virtue and suffering, these are not things that are abstract to him. They're realities that he has lived through his whole life. He knows them from the inside, and so when he presents them in this great story, they're real. So he's able to present pictures of virtue and of beauty, and they're believable because he's really been living those evangelical counsels.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Let's transition to this big question of the fact that Tolkien was a Catholic and Lewis was an Anglican, and how that the relationship to each other as, in a sense, like separated brethren, what that means to each of their evangelical, their evangelistic work, I suppose. Michael, let me throw it back over to you and ask you the very simple question that I heard you answer for someone else a day or two ago, I believe. I think that the audience would be interested to hear your answer. Why did Lewis never become a Catholic?
Because he didn't receive the call to become a Catholic, or at least he didn't hear it. And I think that is the honest answer. Jim Comer, who's a Lewis scholar in New York City, he's written on this topic and points out very prudently, very wisely, that Lewis was a sufficiently mature Christian to know that if he had received the call to enter the Catholic Church and resisted it, he would have known that he was in deep spiritual peril, because he would have been disobeying his conscience. So we just have to accept the fact that for some reason he did not either receive it or did not hear it. Peter Kraft, another Lewis scholar in America, said that Lewis would have lost large tranches of his audience if he had become a Catholic, and that in the providence of the mysterious providence of God, that may have been, as it were, the better path. That Lewis, he was a baptized believer. He was in that sense within the household of faith. Obviously, a separated brother, as Catholics would have to say, but nonetheless, he had received that sacrament of initiation into the Catholic faith. And if he had gone whole hog in, he would immediately have lost millions of readers, both during his lifetime and in the decades since. It's a mysterious topic. Lewis himself, of course, he would have said, he would have advanced various reasons why he did not regard the Catholic Church as something he needed to enter, but not, and indeed he described himself rather disingenuously, actually, as a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, neither especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else, which is nonsense, because he was very high Anglican. He went to confession. He fasted on Fridays. He believed in purgatory. He prayed for the dead. He talked about the Blessed Sacrament. He believed in a male-only priesthood, had a very high view of priesthood. He doubted the virtues of the morality of contraception. He had a high view of natural theology. All these very Catholic or Catholic-friendly beliefs and practices and dispositions. And the fact that he was such close friends with Tolkien and various other Catholics indicates how very Catholic and Anglican he was. There were one or two things he just couldn't get over. to do with the Pope and to do with the Blessed Virgin, but in all these other respects, he was much more Catholic than many Catholics.
Yeah. I wonder if I could just follow up by inviting you to give us your take on something that I'm sure any reader of Mere Christianity will remember, which is Lewis's famous analogy at the beginning, where he talks about being in a hallway or something of that nature, a passageway, a hallway that then leads into rooms. What is your take on what does he mean by that?
Yeah, so in Mere Christianity, this book that grew out of those radio broadcasts he gave during the Second World War, he assembles those talks, those rather disparate talks, under this umbrella term of Mere Christianity, and explains what that means in a preface. And he says that Mere Christianity, as he's using the term, refers to the broad central mainstream of the faith, to which Anglicans and Catholics and Methodists and Presbyterians would all assent. And indeed, he sent out a draft of the book to be read by representatives of these different traditions to see whether they thought it was acceptable. And they did. So what he means by Mere Christianity is that overlap between the various traditions, denominations, ecclesial communities, however you want to term them, the Vincentian canon, as it's sometimes been called, what has been believed by all Christians in all places at all times. That's what he means by the hallway, and that's what he's beckoning people into. He's not going to tell them whether they need to become Anglicans or Catholics or Presbyterians. Just accept this, and then once you've entered the hallway, then you can choose which room of the house you're going to go and spend your time in, because it's in the rooms where there are chairs and fires and meals. But the hallway is just an entrance passage where you take off your coat and put down your umbrella. And if he can beckon anybody into that hall, he said he will have achieved what he was setting out to accomplish. And the rest he will leave to you to sort out under your own steam. And he says, but the main thing, he says, is in your choice of the room to go into, you must be motivated by questions of truth and holiness. Does true holiness reside in this room? Or am I merely attracted by the paneling on the door, or by the particular doorkeeper? No, that's not an adequate reason for going into the room. You must ask much more searching spiritual questions to do with holiness and piety and charity in order to select your particular room. Now, from a Catholic point of view, this ecclesiological model doesn't work very well, unless you sort of reinterpret the hallway, as I think it can fairly legitimately be interpreted, in the sense I just mentioned, to do with the sacrament of baptism. That all Christians who have received baptism in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit have received a valid sacrament. The Catholic Church teaches that. So you could understand, from a Catholic point of view, the hallway in that sense. Yeah. And then I think it makes a little bit better logic. Yeah.
What would Tolkien make of this? What were his feelings of the fact that Lewis didn't become Catholic, and maybe what was his ecumenical theology?
Well, interestingly, Tolkien was very, very ecumenically minded, and he was very clear throughout his life that Lewis, though an Anglican, was a fellow Christian, was a brother in the faith. And we don't have any details about what he thought about Lewis staying an Anglican. Sort of fairly obviously, he would have wished him to go on and to become a Catholic, but it didn't impair their friendship at all. And he was a member of the Inklings, that group of Christians who met and socially and met to share their works, read from their works in progress, of which there were a number of Catholics, but mostly Anglicans and I think one Presbyterian. And he participated in discussions about matters of theology as well. Going at it, discussing these things with his separated brethren. In a way that was friendly. He said the conversation suddenly got quite lively, so that you might think, as you looked at the conversation, that they were foes, about to come to blows with each other. But this was just the dynamic enthusiasm of the conversation, because they would emerge as complete friends at the end of it. And he said at one point that even to love our Lord and to call him Lord is a grace and may lead to more graces. And I think that's a fundamental sort of summary of how he viewed this, that sacrament of baptism brings all of them in to the church, and that there's that grace in acknowledging our Lord as Lord, that is a grace, as it will bring more graces. And he was always, I think, keenly aware of the goodness of the faith of his non-Catholic brethren. I mean, for instance, when Charles Williams, one of the Inklings, died in 1945, he had a mass said for him at Blackfriars in Oxford and served at it, which in 1945 was a very ecumenical gesture to make for an Anglican. And he did the same when Lewis died. He had a mass said for him and served at it, and went to Lewis's funeral, an Anglican funeral. And he quoted with approval something that the Anglican Williams said, that the duty of every Christian is to tend the accredited altar, even though the Holy Spirit might choose to come down in some other place. So he explicitly acknowledges that there is an accredited altar in his view. There is the one church. He's very clear that he believes that the Catholic Church is the one church established by Christ. But he acknowledges that our Lord is not limited. He says that explicitly, that our Lord is not limited by the church that he has established and can grant graces to those who are outside of it. And I think that sort of generosity of spirit is so typical of Tolkien. And what he's doing is he is in line with the church teaching that eventually became, fully codified in the decree on ecumenism in the Second Vatican Council. But Tolkien had been living that for decades before it became a council document.
That's interesting. Let me stay with you, Holly, and maybe just pivot slightly to what Tolkien sort of hoped to accomplish for the sake of Christ and the church with his writing. When he was writing The Lord of the Rings, in a way, I always think of it as almost a kind of, he just couldn't help himself. There was this world that he just had to build, and these stories just sort of came out miraculously from them. But, that's maybe overstating it a little bit. But, I mean, did he have a sort of conscious understanding that what he was writing could affect the hearts of people for Christ, and maybe even sort of win them for the church?
That's such a great question, Andrew, because the answer is yes, but the kind of a qualified yes, because he's very, very clear that The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. I repeat, not an allegory, and he doesn't want it to be interpreted as such. And I think he wanted to make sure people didn't make these superficial sort of equivalencies. That said, I mean, he said of The Lord of the Rings, he said, The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing, but consciously in the revision. And he goes on to say, and that is why I have cut out all references to religion in it. And if you're thinking to yourself, wait, what? No, I didn't get the quote wrong. He said he wrote it just without consciously thinking about it being Catholic or Christian. It came from his deep faith. And at one point, someone asked him, like, oh, well, who is Eru Iluvatar, the God in The Lord of the Rings? He says, well, the God, the one, our God. Like, there's only one, and it's the God of The Lord of the Rings is the one. But then consciously, he's seeing it in the revision, in the polishing, making it consciously religious and Catholic. And he's doing it by making sure that there are not these overt references to religion. And I have puzzled over this a lot. And I think it has to do with his approach to evangelization, which is one of many. It's not that this is the only way to do it, but it was his way, which is to go kind of under the radar, to be presenting these images at the level of image, these ideas at the level of image, of theme, where he's suggesting them, So, for instance, he's quite clear in his letters that lembas, the way bread of the elves, is the Eucharist. Insofar as we can make a direct connection, he's pretty clear that this is a Eucharistic image. And if you go and you reread it, you realize, oh, it really is. It's this food that is sustaining, and the more that you rely on it, the more it sustains you. It's a beautiful, beautiful image, but it's all the more powerful because he doesn't put it in your face. And you think about the way that he unfolds the working of providence with Frodo. Frodo is saved. He's saved from becoming the new Sauron, and because Frodo fails in the quest. This is an important thing to realize. He gets all the way to Mount Doom, and he has been broken by the ring, and he seizes the ring for his own and declares that he will not fulfill the quest. And Tolkien said in one of his letters that this was actually a working through of the theme of the petition in the Our Father, lead us not into temptation. And so providentially, Gollum tries to seize the ring and fulfills the quest in that way. Why was Gollum there? Because at an earlier stage, Frodo, and then also Sam, and then also Bilbo further back in The Hobbit, had chosen to spare Gollum's life, even though he deserved death. They exercised mercy and pity. And so we see the workings of providence, and providence is actually named explicitly in this. So this is the kind of way that he's working this out. And I think because of that, The Lord of the Rings becomes extraordinarily effective in reaching people who perhaps would be not willing to read a book that was more explicitly Christian. And he does, in another letter, he says that The Lord of the Rings is an exemplary legend in the sense that he intends it to be an example, a picture of the virtues. You should look at it and say, I want to be virtuous in this way and that way. But he's weaving it all in so subtly that it's not in your face. You take it in and you think, wow, this is really beautiful. I like that. I want that. Where can I find that?
And he succeeded. I've got a friend in Oxford who recently told me that he, in his pre-Christian days, read The Lord of the Rings and found it so beautiful that he said to himself, Tolkien was a Christian, and anybody who can write a work that is that beautiful must be onto something. Which led this friend of mine to become a Christian himself.
That's very interesting. Let me throw the same kind of question to you, Michael, because where Holly says Tolkien was, in a sense, like deliberately making his work religious by removing the religion, Lewis seems to be doing the exact opposite. I mean, the Aslan is just sort of obviously this Christ figure, and it sort of goes on from there. I mean, is he deliberately employing just a very different strategy from Tolkien? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think Tolkien was much more naturally mythological, mythopoeic than Lewis. And an important consideration too is that The Lord of the Rings is set in a pre-Christian era. I mean, it's meant to be part of the history of our world, but long before the incarnation. So in that sense, the lembas bread that sustains you is like an equivalent to the manna. Right. You know, the manna itself gestures towards the Eucharist, and likewise the lembas. But neither of them should be read allegorically as such. And C.S. Lewis, when he came to write the Narnia Chronicles, was not setting his stories in a pre-Christian period of this world. He was inventing a whole other world called Narnia, which is sort of parallel to our world. And so he asked himself if Christ, having become human in our world, were to become incarnate in this magical world, what form would he take and how would it work? And the answer was he would take the form of a lion, and you know the rest of the story, I hope. But that's what he called a supposition. Let us suppose that the Christ became incarnate in a world where animals speak. Let's suppose it worked out in such and such a fashion. And that's supposition, not allegory, as far as Lewis is concerned. The allegory is when you give a concrete form to an abstract thing, like in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. You have giant despair locking people up in Doubting Castle. We know what that character and that place stand for because it's named in their very title. Despair is not a concrete thing, but it's concretized in a giant, and doubt is not a concrete thing, but it's concretized in a castle. And if you don't understand that the thing stands for the abstract term, then you're not properly reading the allegory. Narnia is not like that. You can read the story in its own terms and not make any equivalency with Christianity if you don't wish to. And there are plenty of people who do read it like that, especially children who have no Christian education, but even some adults. The illustrator of the books, Pauline Baynes, who was a young, I think, 21-year-old artist when she was sent the manuscript of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to prepare her illustrations, she read the story and was profoundly moved by it, found herself in tears at the death of Aslan. And it was only when she closed the manuscript and began formulating her ideas for her pictures that it suddenly thought, oh, I've read a story like that somewhere else. And so you don't have to force any kind of allegorical reading upon it. These parallels are more or less strong depending on, well, first of all, your level of religious education, and second of all, in the kind of reading you bring to bear on the book. What else do you want to know?
Well, I will jump in to something, reminding me of something you said, I think in Planet Narnia, about Lewis and Tolkien. I think you, if I recall correctly, you wrote, we must allow the two men to write in different ways. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that there isn't that one of them is better than the other, and how they approach this approach to evangelization in literature, because they've just got different ways of doing it.
Yeah, Lewis was always, he began, at any rate, much more interested in allegory from a literary point of view. Indeed, he wrote a very learned study of medieval allegory called The Allegory of Love. That's how he made his academic reputation. And the first book that he published after he became a Christian, an adult Christian, was a reworking of The Pilgrim's Progress, entitled The Pilgrim's Regress. So he had a strong academic interest in allegory as such. But I think you can see as his writing career progresses that he finds it actually more advantageous, more judicious to adopt more subtle correspondences between the story world and the world of real life Christianity, so that Narnia is, as I say, more suppositional than allegorical. And the last novel Lewis wrote was a retelling of a classical myth, the myth of Cupid and Psyche, and the subtitle of that novel, Till We Have Faces, is A Myth Retold. So he's, as it were, I think, being gradually dragged in a Tolkienian direction as his writing career unfolds.
That's interesting. I don't know if literary scholars might say, maybe it's the difference between like an early medievalist and a late medievalist or something, But anyway, in the minutes that remain, I want to just kind of move towards this, like, the vision of hope that both of the authors project, but also the realism. It's not optimism, right? It's joy in Lewis's terms, or hope. We could maybe use both words. But I'm thinking, Holly, about how in Tolkien, if you read the Silmarillion, he tells us the story of the end of the world twice, at least, right? At the end of the first age, at the end of the second age. And then in The Lord of the Rings, we get this end of an age story that is full of really disturbing stuff, right? Like the return of this darkness. And then this character of Saruman, who, I don't know if anyone here like me sort of identifies him as this sort of, this awful kind of modern character, who wants to kind of brutalize nature and reduce everything into, these sort of, I don't know, to sort of take everything out of the realm of the pure and beautiful and that sort of thing, right? And adulterate it or something like that. So, but ultimately, The Lord of the Rings is, just an incredibly inspiring story and a triumph of hope. But I don't know, just want to throw it to you in an open-ended way. Like, is that your reading of Tolkien? I mean, how does that play, do you think, for us as evangelists to kind of champion his work?
Well, I think, again, this is a great question, because Tolkien's work is deeply infused with hope and with joy, but in a very deeply realistic way. I mean, this is a man who knew suffering. He was an orphan. He had fought in the Great War. His friends had been killed. He had suffered physical illness all of his life. He had been poor. He knew suffering. And so what we see in The Lord of the Rings and all of his writings is a hope that is tempered with realism. It's not wish fulfillment at all. It's a hope that's grounded in faith, and it's a hope that does not pretend that there isn't a whole lot of suffering to endure along the way. And if you think about it, The Lord of the Rings, okay, Sauron is defeated, Middle-earth is saved, we're all rejoicing, this is beautiful, but we have to remember, Frodo has been wounded, and I think one of the saddest and most beautiful lines of the whole book, it comes near the end, when Frodo is back in the Shire, and he's not doing well. And he says to Sam, he says, well, the Shire has been saved, but not for me. He has been wounded so deeply that he cannot be healed in this life. And I think that is a pretty profound insight into our sufferings in this life. He knew there are some wounds that will not be healed while we live, that will only be healed, after our death. And I think that is part of what gives his vision of hope such power. And I briefly alluded to the essay on fairy stories. And in that great essay, in the epilogue, he makes really a proclamation of the gospel. And he says that the reason that we rejoice in the happy ending of a fairy story or the happy ending of, say, The Lord of the Rings is, in fact, because these are echoes in the real world. They're echoes of a real world happy ending, which is the resurrection. And he coins the word eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe. And he says that the resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the incarnation, which is itself the eucatastrophe of the whole of human history. So it's the eucatastrophe is the sudden happy ending when everything seems to be lost. And you can't have that turn for joy unless you truly think that everything has been lost, which is precisely what we see on Calvary, right? It looks like hope is utterly lost. He's dead on the cross, but we have the resurrection. And that is the cosmic happy ending that he says really happened. And this is where legend and history meet and fuse, because that real happy ending is what gives the power to all these fictional happy endings. But he says that the eucatastrophe does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and suffering. And he's very clear on that. And I think that is a huge message for us as evangelists, that we live in a world that is broken. We are broken. Our world is broken. We are all have suffered, will suffer, are suffering. The people that we meet who need to hear the gospel are also broken and suffering. And acknowledging that pain does not take away from the message of hope. In fact, it gives credibility to it. And I think that's part of what makes Tolkien's message so powerful.
Yeah. Michael, I would say that in a couple of key works, Lewis is very pessimistic, and yet hopeful. And the works that I'm thinking of would be That Hideous Strength in fiction and The Abolition of Man in nonfiction. What do you think those works, maybe, or others, have to say sort of in the same vein as where we were going there in Holly's answer?
Yeah, I think The Abolition of Man is possibly Lewis's most pessimistic work. I mean, the very title, The Abolition of Man, he's not painting a bright future. But that's a philosophical work. And therefore, Lewis is just, as it were, outlining, forecasting the end result of a particular chain of philosophical thought, namely subjectivism, the idea of value not being objective. If that's the position you adopt, you'll eventually abolish yourself. You will make yourself inhuman or subhuman. So that is very pessimistic. That Hideous Strength is a kind of novelistic version of The Abolition of Man, but in a much more of a Christian key. So that work does end with some notes of hope. But hope, the theological virtue of hope, is not the same thing as optimism. And interestingly, Lewis wrote a review of The Lord of the Rings when it was published in the 1950s, and he said, here in The Lord of the Rings, we are released from facile optimism and wailing pessimism alike. He quotes his favourite line from the novel, there was gathering dark then, and bravery, and deeds that were not wholly vain, not wholly in vain. It is the cool middle point between illusion and disillusionment, he says. And that's one of the things that he most admired in The Lord of the Rings, which, by the way, without Lewis's endless encouragement, driven to the point of nagging at times, Tolkien admits he would never have completed. So Tolkien was hugely influential on Lewis becoming a Christian. Lewis was hugely influential on Tolkien writing his and completing his masterpiece. So that was quite a good trade-off, I think. As for Lewis's own presentations of theological hope, yeah, I'm glad, Holly, that you mentioned Calvary, because, I mean, the one scriptural verse that C.S. Lewis refers to or alludes to more than any other, I think, is the cry of dereliction, the cry from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? From Psalm 22. And Lewis was fascinated by this cry even before he was a theist, let alone a Christian. And it crops up in all his writings in one form or another. And it speaks to this very point of eucatastrophe. The good catastrophe depends upon a catastrophe. The goodness only emerges from the utter ruination of all your natural hopes. And unless you have got to that point of despair, of achieving natural hopes, supernatural hope can't really land, that the seed won't sprout, as it were. So in the Narnia Chronicles, for instance, Lewis has his own version of the apocalypse in the last battle, which is the Narnian version of the book of Revelation. Where everything goes from bad to worse. And there is a sort of Narnian equivalent of the cry of dereliction, when the Narnian king, despairing of saving his kingdom from the invading hordes, cries out in the darkness. He's bound to a tree, significant location, and he cries out in the darkness, praying to the Christ-like Aslan, come and save us now. And the coldness and the darkness go on just as before, we're told. And then, reaching down into the very roots of his faith, as it were, this fictional king says, let me be killed. I ask nothing for myself, but come and save all Narnia. And it's at that moment of complete self-abnegation and self-gift that, indeed, his prayer is answered, and all sorts of aid, providentially, is coming to his rescue, though he doesn't yet know it. And as a result of this faithful obedience in the darkest hour, he does find his way through to the heavenly realms at the end of the story. And having gone through the gate of death, the very first words which meet him on the other side are, well done, good and faithful servant, who held firm in the darkest hour. So I think Lewis, like Tolkien, having gone through so much suffering, both of them orphans as a boy, both of them went through the First World War, they had wrestled with these deepest, darkest questions. But rather like Brendan said this morning when he was talking about the bombing of Coventry, the bombing of Coventry could have made his great-grandfather bitter, but instead it prompted him to build an altar, or to rebuild an altar. And I think in their own literary ways, Lewis and Tolkien were doing the same.
Well, thank you. We are out of time, but I hope that we all realize that despite the fact that Lewis and Tolkien have been dead a long time, they remain really just about the two best resources we have from the literary canon in recent times for our work of evangelization. So thank you so much, Holly.
Thank you.